So I wanted to use this time to talk about recent rhythm game events, as I think there's a number of things that are definitely worth talking about that I thought were really interesting in the way these events were handled and just the overall vibe of how these events went, you know? We had BPL Sun Vortex Grand Finals publicly available to watch on last Wednesday, I believe, and that same Saturday we had 3 rhythm game events essentially firing off within sequence of each other, which is a pretty big rarity in this kind of landscape, especially post-COVID, where rhythm games haven't really been doing so hot in comparison to a lot of other games, so that was pretty nice to see. We had Bear Cup, which is an annual 2DX event where a lot of top players and rankers often play in a pretty competitive environment for. It's fairly high profile, I want to say. We had Silk Hat Cup, which is basically the same thing but for Sound Vortex, and a lot of Bimani Pro League Sound Vortex players, draft nominees, and other top players from around the world actually ended up playing in that event, so it's equally as stacked. And then we had the Project Sekai Championships going on roughly around the same time. I don't really have much of an opinion on games like Project Sekai, but it's still a fairly big event nonetheless, and I think it's definitely worth talking about a little bit. An area I want to focus on a little bit is viewer experience, and I know a lot of people throw this term around and it generally doesn't mean much, but what I mean by viewer experience is, how does it feel to watch these events? Can I comprehend what I'm looking at? Generally speaking, even for the grassroots events like Bear Cup and Silk Hat Cup, the viewer experience overall was actually pretty good. It wasn't too shabby on many fronts, and honestly the production quality was quite tight. I think we've definitely come a long way from the very confusing, cluttered, cramped UI layouts that we've had for streams pre-COVID, and nowadays it's honestly a lot easier to see what's going on, especially with events like BPL where you have that massive bar at the top that tells you who's in the lead or who isn't for Sound Vortex, for instance. I think it's just way better to watch for the audience nowadays than it was maybe a few years ago when we were having the last KAC before COVID hit. This experience is amplified a bit by having a proper competitive metric for a lot of games in recent memory, and in particular I'm talking about Sound Vortex with S-Crit and EX score, because I think it makes these matches a lot more skill determined and it's just an even playing field for people who are more like S-Crit grinders compared to players who are generally more well known as top rankers by a considerable margin, which is something we saw quite a lot at BPL, especially in the tag battle stages. It makes games a lot more fair for the players and more exciting for the audience, so I hope that more events try and adopt a similar kind of competitive metric in future, though obviously not all rhythm games are created the same way, so it will probably be a little bit more difficult to adopt that kind of thing. Something I was impressed by was how minimal the downtime was between games, especially at the grassroots events. I thought it was quite well organized all round and is definitely something that I hope that they keep maintaining a standard of in future events for sure. One aspect I want to touch upon in a bit more detail is the commentary game, because commentary has stepped up a lot in recent memory for rhythm game events in general, all across the board. We've got a strong balance now between casters who have a lot of game knowledge, audience retention, and passion for the game, which helps keep these events incredibly diverse to watch and makes them feel unique at the same time. A good example of this is at BPL, where even commentators who aren't super well versed at a particular game, like with Mori Icho for instance, help to keep these matches and events super entertaining and or insightful, which is a department that I think the FGC has had us beat in for probably a decade now, and is something we could stand to take some notes from there. Compare this to the commentary for YCS 250th LA, where it was fairly dry and generally was quite lacking if you already knew enough about the current format of Yu-Gi-Oh already. There's a pretty good complaint about the event that I think really sums things up. Being a good player doesn't make you a good commentator, and to that end, having commentators who aren't well known in the scene but are still able to provide that kind of high level analysis while also being engaging is the play that BPL has paved the way for. There's a market for events that capitalize on there, and we've already seen this within BPL itself, where they were taking pro level players and having them on comms for everything after regular stage, which is definitely an approach that I think they should capitalize on a bit more. What I'm basically trying to say here is, if you hire good commentators for these events, you don't have to worry about downtime, so that is something that I think TOs should take a lot more note of. On top of this, events in general have just been way better lately compared to events that we've had pre-COVID, and we get a lot more of them to boot. BPL Season 1 had a bunch of dream matches or unofficial side events that were super fun to watch and just added another layer of content that was nice to have in between the downtime between regular stages and onwards. Adding to that, BPL Season 2 has had a lot more of these kinds of things going on, and we're starting to see a lot more players involved in these events start to stream a lot more as well. I think during Sound Vortex US alone, there wasn't a single week where we didn't have at least 1 or 2 players either streaming, talking about the game, or discussing events going on surrounding the game on things like Trads Radio, which I think is something that a lot more events should be trying to take advantage of, to have that kind of group discussion going on. Even just in this month alone, we had a 3-day weekend at the start of the month where a bunch of BPL players were just playing the game on stream. That's wild to think about, considering that maybe even 2 to 3 years prior, we didn't have that kind of level of engagement between players and an audience. We are still getting events post-COVID, and contrary to popular belief, it did not destroy the autogay scene as hard as a lot of doomsayers tend to think. The quality of these events has gone up substantially in that period. You look at even gacha games like Girls Band Party, Garupa, and Project Sekai, where you're getting these kinds of KAC-like events now, while King of Performai, KAC itself, and BPL are just becoming a lot more esports-like in terms of general production quality every single year. It's starting to look really clean. I mean, look at last week. You do not see that happening very often with autogay, but the fact it can happen now shows that there's still signs for the genre to grow, and that's something that I'm very, very happy with. One thing that these events have definitely started to push is the idea of skill representation, and more specifically, the idea that skill representation at these events has been crucial for new player appeal. A lot of people in the English-speaking sphere don't really pay attention to players at Southeast Asia events like KAC, unless it's either someone from their scene or someone that they already know is basically making waves in the game already. And to be honest, I think that kind of perspective is super detrimental to growing an audience for these games outside of Japan and maybe Korea. Events like BPL in particular have been super important for, in a way, forcing attention to players with less name recognition overseas, because it highlights just how diverse these player skill sets are, while also reminding prospective newcomers to both the genre and particular games that the road to this level of play isn't just a one and done journey, because you only really ever see the end step of it. There's an interesting tweet by a participant in the Project Sekai Championships that gave me a bit of food for thought about how different the mentalities are between US and European players and Southeast Asia players who enter these kinds of events. And it's that wanting to enter these events solely to win or to show off how good you are at the game actually hurts those who want to play your game competitively, because it creates the impression that players are only really important to these events if they perform exceptionally well, rather than what talents or particular skills they can bring to the overall experience. To that end then, I think later KAC events and BPL have been monumental in giving equal opportunity to a wide variety of players, rather than the select few top rankers who more or less define their game's histories in some way. It's been really good in advertising the appeal of these events to overseas players, as Nori and Silkhat showed very well by targeting English-speaking audiences during BPL Season 1. That being said, there is still some room for improvement with a lot of these events. The big change for me would probably be having a consistent scoring format like EX Score that's most accurate to player skill. I think basically every game that isn't reliant on combo scoring could stand to benefit from some variant of EX Score, but Megamix battles in Sound Vortex have generally proven that having something that shakes up the formula enough is probably fine to let go as it is. That leads me on to my next point, which is downtime. It's usually unavoidable at bigger events, but man, even during BPL, you had some moments where it felt really sluggish, especially during grand finals, where it was one tempo off in many senses, and you could really feel a sense of disorganization there that could probably be improved just a little bit. I think that's where commentary really helped to shine through for that event, and is something that all events could stand to improve on that front. I already talked about commentary a fair bit, but I think having commentators who are enthusiastic about the game or games as a whole, rather than just the players involved or what the play-by-play is, while also having that broad game knowledge instead of depth, is definitely a change that will do wonders for the most part. The MC aspect is already something that's surprisingly good for a number of events. I really enjoyed watching Bear Cup, and I felt time was well accounted for on the organization part, but just working a little bit on certain commentary aspects will tighten up that experience a hell of a lot more. Maybe getting more pro players on the mic more often could be a welcome change in the right direction. Having that kind of insight that only top rankers are aware of can be a useful learning tool as well as entertainment. But now the question is, where does competitive autogay go from here? Having more events is 100% a step in the right direction. It's easier said than done because cabs are hard to reserve, audiences are scarce for that kind of thing outside of Japan and Korea, and most people outside of those regions play in these kinds of events because they want to get that autogay prestige prestige. I beg people who are wanting to TO for more rhythm game events, please host events if you can find an opportunity and an audience to do so. That leads me on to my other point, which is support events for your game. Unless they're run by people who are generally just not very nice, or the event itself is beyond redemption for some reason, support your scene. The FGC does it, so there's no excuse for us not to do it either. So many games live and die based on the reception that even small events like Bear Cup and Silcat Cup get. So just give TOs and players alike a chance. People in this scene give the impression to outside viewers that they care more about the clout or the money or the reputation than the games. So try and take this opportunity to prove the detractors wrong and give back to a game that means something to you as well. I'll leave things off by asking you a few questions. Where do you think competitive rhythm game events could stand to improve on? Do you think we should have more of them? And most importantly, where do you think competitive rhythm game events can go from here? Let me know how you feel in the comments.